Good morning, good morning, good morning. All right. If you repeat after me, if you can clap with me. Yeah, thank you for the applause. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Outspoken Bean. I'm with Writers in the Schools and the coach of Metaphor Houston from Houston, Texas. Texas, what's up, y'all? And, the reception and the love that Metaphor, the team from Metaphor received yesterday was so warm and so welcoming. We decided we'll just do it again. How's that? You all right, y'all? So, y'all remember what to do, right? Y'all remember, right? You can, we one mic, so make sure all the attention is this way. But also, right, if you hear a line or you hear a word that touches you consensually and not physically, but in the heart, all right, okay. You can snap your fingers. Let me hear you snap. All right. If you didn't learn how to snap or you don't know how to, where were you when you were 6? What were you doing? Right. You can tap your table. Let me hear you tap. All right. Yeah. You can remember the other one that you can thunder. You can stomp your feet. Right. And you can do all of those together while cheering. 1, 2, 3. Let's hear it. Now keep that energy going, keep that going for our first poet, Isabella.
Hi, my name is Isabella. I'm a freshman at Washington University in St. Louis, and the poem that I'll be performing is about cultural appropriation of Latin cuisine in America. On a little street in San Bernardino, California, you can find Mitla Cafe, a restaurant owned by Salvador and Lucia Rodriguez, 2 immigrants from Jalisco, Mexico. They celebrate their pedigrees through cultural recipes, but while they made hard-shell tacos stuffed with ground beef and cheese, an American man named Glenn Bell saw their popularity. He learned the Mexican recipes and decided that money was more important than authenticity. So he founded Taco Bell while Mitla Cafe received no credit for their creations, only a white man's exploitation of Mexican people. Taco Bell is one of many franchises that profits from assimilated homemade cuisine, which is why this country isn't a home made for me. All I see is the slicing and dicing of my customs into a large pot of commercialism. I can't ignore the whitewashed Latin restaurants that lack soul in their flavors because the food was never made to favor the people who know how to make it best. Appropriation receives the money and fame while Latinos aren't even allowed to stay in a country that loves their meals yet ignores their ordeals. Taco Bell gained every cent and left 2 Mexican immigrants without an ounce of respect, which actually makes sense when you think about the American sentiments towards Latin immigrants. Latinos are seen as too foreign while their food is adored in every place that ignores race and only focuses on the taste because they don't think about the people and the cultures being erased. Assimilated platters of cuisine is everything this country has seen, so everyone thinks Latinos eat the same thing. But I won't let our recipes rest in peace. If you praise Latin foods, then you should learn to praise the people who mix and mash, glaze and steam the vegetables and meat, the spice and the creams, because on a little street in San Bernardino, California, you can find Mitla Cafe, a restaurant owned by Salvador and Lucia Rodriguez, 2 Mexican immigrants who were ripped away of recognition when they should have been lauded in celebration. We watch the crumbs of our complex culture get scraped off the plate, the leftovers this country refuses to celebrate. But I won't let our originality be half-baked because whether it's una bandeja paisa, enchiladas de queso, or tacos dorados de Mitla Cafe, the flavors we add to this melting pot will be the best thing America ever tastes. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Kylan Denny. I'm a freshman at Stanford University. Sorry, excuse me. And so I wrote this poem for my mom. She is a paramedic, and I feel like there are a lot of struggles that women, especially in emergency fields of emergency work, they go through a lot of struggles unnoticed, and my mom in particular is my biggest hero, so I wrote this for her, and it is titled Rainy Day. In the second grade, my teacher had to call home to my mom. In the second grade, my teacher had to call home to my mom because I was really, really, really scared of the rain. Something about the whole lightning shows and thunder cracks not appealing to 7-year-old me, but hearing my mom's voice would calm my soul and make the weight of my fear feel lighter. And maybe that was a trade-off, because I still wonder how heavy the responsibility of being a paramedic fell on my mother's shoulders. On people's worst days, she answered the call, many sent to God, but got my mother instead, and blessed they were too. Because let me tell you, she makes miracles out of misery, handles tragedy with a kindness many have to work years to achieve. In a downpour of hail that could only mirror the resemblance of hell, she has picked pieces of people off streets and made them whole again. While Hurricane Harvey was a terrifying time for many, people sat at home watching the rain pass. My mother was out there working on an ambulance to save the lives that somebody's God was willing to leave behind. Working as the only black female paramedic in her company isn't for the faint of heart. She had to have armored skin and guts of steel to withstand the storm of racial and misogynistic insults. They tried to tell her she wasn't good enough because they knew that next to them, her skill made it clear as day that their own inadequacy was palpable. They tried to put her in the background, but her kindness had already been felt by each patient she treated. They gave her every reason to quit, but she kept coming back because that is what a strong black woman does when she's told she can't. Since the second grade, I've known my mother to be the living, breathing definition of a survivor. She always answered the call to be the savior for those who didn't even know they were in need of saving. From my perspective, a child's perspective, her on call meant her body at home but her mind on duty, because working emergency 911 ain't a 9-to-5 job. Tragedy doesn't have hours of operations. My mother has tragedies trailing behind her like raindrops after a storm. She's had to push and pull over the right for her own peace of mind, but do not forget she is a paramedic and has picked up the pieces of her still on call and made herself whole again. And yeah, she's never called me when the downpour of the past comes beating on her door, but that won't stop me from leaving a message. Ma, let me testify. Make my voice heard louder than the thunder of your mind and speak past the fear trying to drown you. I am not a licensed paramedic, and I do not know how to save lives, but I know that I will never give up on you. You are my home, even in the midst of a storm, and when the time comes, should you need arms to fall into, Mom, I promise I will always be here waiting, on call. Thank you.
Good morning. Got it. So, hi, my name is Ariana Lee. I'm a freshman at Stanford University. I'm also the 2023 Houston Youth Poet Laureate. And because this event is called the Opportunity Youth Forum, I thought I'd share a poem about an event that happened in Houston that was not an equal opportunity disaster. This poem I wrote for the anniversary of Hurricane Harvey, and it's called Through the Eye. I was 12 years old. My friend joked, I can't ever see rain the same again. Only the storm. The roofs of submerged houses like lily pads, the news going 24/7. Born in the year of Katrina, graduating high school through a pandemic, my generation will get diplomas in disaster, degrees in damage. What kind of city are we inheriting? Each once-in-a-lifetime flood is a watershed moment, but we've had so many, they've watered down this community. 6 years later, are we still Houston strong? Do we still have that outpouring of love to fight the downpour? We're swamped with work to fix this swamp, where flood mitigation benefits the people who need it the least, who would prefer high ground over taking the high road. We don't see rain the same. Some see a deluge, others see delusion. Leveling and raising homes won't raise up our communities of color if we don't get a say in how we rebuild. To get to where Houston can be headed, we need roofs over everybody's heads. This is a city of innovators. The iconic graffiti in downtown comes to mind to be someone. This is a city full of someones. It must be something in the water, but we don't see the same. Let's try looking through the eye of a hurricane. So many volunteers show up, some have to be turned away. Strangers muck out each other's houses. Neighbors rescue neighbors in their kayaks, boats, and canoes. A different flood and a different Noah's Ark. While Arkema explodes and families evacuate and floodways fill. Our dams couldn't hold Harvey, but we have so much capacity in this city to say in all our languages, Wa'aini, te amo, I love you. I was 12 years old. I'd never seen love of that magnitude. Yes, deeper injustices surfaced from the flood waters. Its murk made inequity clear. But when we see rain, we remember what kind of city we're inheriting. A city that floods, a city that loves, a city that survives. Thank you.
Good morning, Aspen Opportunity Youth family. All right. So welcome to day 2 of our national convening. Welcome to our plenary on narrative change. When I tell you that the Forum Fam has been dreaming about this conversation we are going to have here together this morning, I am overcome with excitement. So in case it's helpful, and also as a friendly reminder, I want to walk you all through our learning agenda for the convening, including how we landed on why it's so important to have a conversation this morning on narrative change. So as you all know, we opened up the convening with a compelling call to action from Dr. Michael McAfee. He called us to have a founder's orientation and to continue to fearlessly work toward ensuring our democracy works for all of us. That call to have a founder's orientation is an invitation to reimagine the future and then, through our liberation work, bring the vision of an inclusive and an effective democracy to fruition. Dr. McAfee talked about how words like diversity, equity, and inclusion are just words when they are not coupled with practices that are grounded, anchored in an institution, working to change the systems and the structures in ways that bring about the democracy we are all seeking, the democracy we all deserve. The next plenary of our network, the Belonging, Meaning, Wellbeing, and Purpose plenary, was designed in many ways to be a response to Dr. McAfee's call to action. Even in its early stages, we are clear that our belonging, meaning, well-being, and purpose work is exactly how we intend to operationalize equity over the next 10, 20 plus years. And while we wanted to begin to define each of the concepts and then collectively consider how the concepts connect to each other in ways that feed our vision, we hope that you all were able to see that the practices of fostering greater belonging, affirming racial and cultural identity, enhancing well-being, and unlocking purpose are necessary precursors to enacting a founder's orientation that can serve to galvanize our young adult partners in ways that shift our country toward making the impossible possible, a more inclusive, just, and effective democracy that works for all. We hope that between the opening plenary and the lunch plenary, some of the dots are beginning to come together as you gain deeper insight into how we are thinking about our everyday work. And As we consider the goals of our belonging, meaning, well-being, and purpose work, including our commitment to drive system and narrative change, it felt critical to define what we mean by narrative change and then connect the concepts of narrative change to cultural strategy, because our work over the next 10 years is about shifting mindsets in ways that will shift the narrative. Our vision is that this room and this movement will grow, and we will continue to talk to each other, but we'll broaden the tent and we'll be talking to many more people, many of whom may not share our same ideology, some of whom may not exactly share our vision, but in doing our cultural strategy work and shifting minds and shifting hearts, we can collectively move towards that vision of all. And the path to get there is going to be through our narrative and cultural strategy work. And so, as we begin to think through how to design a learning agenda around narrative change, knowing that we want to build a strong foundation grounded in key concepts associated with narrative change, so that together we may scaffold our learning in the months and years ahead, we began dreaming about which partners could help in this beautiful, critical, indelible moment. And so you all must know that we are honored. We are joyful. I hope you can hear in my voice when I say we are joyful to have this group of leaders working to advance narrative change here with us this morning. See, although it may feel like we all have been talking about narrative change across the social sector for decades, the field is actually still quite nascent. Meaningful, transformative understanding about how to do narrative change in ways that garner policy wins, in ways that change the structures and systems that continue to perpetuate inequity. It is that level of understanding that we are seeking so that we can achieve victory in the equity movement. Noting, again, that this work is still emergent. So we are especially honored to feature different partners who not only have deep expertise on how to advance narrative change, they also represent beautiful, diverse, and inclusive range of approaches aimed at achieving this goal. And so now that you all have that context, including insight into why this conversation is so timely, why this conversation is so important, I am over the moon to introduce you all to Nayantara Sen. Nayantara is a first-generation Bengali immigrant, a trilingual storyteller and fiction writer, a narrative and cultural strategist, and a political educator. She is the director of field and funder learning at the Pop Culture Collaborative and the lead designer and narrative strategist for the Butterfly Lab for Immigrant Narrative Strategy at Race Forward. At the Collaborative, she supports learning. I know y'all, exactly, that's how I feel. At the Collaborative, she supports learning immersions, capacity building, and partnerships across a broad field and funder learning portfolio. She advises on narrative labs and cohorts and incubates 2 emergent projects, Culture Change U, a narrative and cultural training and learning institute, and Project Azadi, a national network of narrative and cultural strategists and practitioners. Nayantara, without question, is one of the foremost thinkers, leaders, and teachers on narrative change. And in addition to bringing her wisdom, thoughtfulness, and keen insight to this work, she also leads with deep humility. I want y'all to know that I love music. I love hip hop. I especially love old school hip hop. So I mean this in the most respectful way possible when I say that she is like a tight verse over a dope beat. I'm just saying, y'all, I'm just saying. And we are honored that she is here today to share her knowledge with us. And after her keynote address, she will be joined by Holly Cook Macarro, principal at The Angle, Nat Kendall Taylor, Chief Executive Officer of Frameworks Institute, Zouhair Mussa, leader at Youth Speaks, and Michelle Mush-Lee, Executive Director of Youth Speaks. And now, please join me in welcoming Nayantara to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you all this morning, and thank you so much, Monique, for that kind and detailed introduction. I think that might have been one of the best compliments I've ever received. So I hope you all are feeling well rested, yeah, and caffeinated and comfortable, because we are about to dive into some pretty juicy and big topics about narrative and cultural strategies. And I know you're looking forward to the plenary too, and you'll have questions for all of us. So as Monique briefly shared, I am a narrative and cultural strategist. I've spent the last 15 years working at the intersection of arts and culture, narrative change, and social justice movement building, and I've worked across a range of sectors and issues, from immigration to gender justice to participatory governance to racial justice. But this is my professional life, which I've somehow arrived at through a series of twists and turns and accidents, and maybe not so much a traditional career trajectory. My personal journey as a young person in the US has been really quite different, and I think greatly mirrored the difficulty, the disconnection, the nihilism, the distrust, and perhaps paradoxically, some of the hope that a lot of young people in the US experience every day. So I immigrated to the US in early 2002, soon after 9/11, and I found myself smack dab in the middle of a hostile, racist, sexist, fearful country that seemed pretty hell-bent on limiting opportunities and freedoms for young brown girls. And at the time, I was young, I was broke, I was uninsured, I was undocumented, I was fairly untethered, and as someone who is a first-generation immigrant from India who ended up in a pretty rural, white, Midwestern town, I learned I was also pretty scared of the racist violence that I was seeing levied against brown people in the early 2000s. So I learned a lot of things as a young person. I learned quickly that I didn't belong in most institutional spaces unless I could pretend that I was American enough, assimilated enough, small enough, unless I didn't rock the boat and contest people in power. And in my teens and early 20s, I did in fact experience painful exclusions, disinvestment, cultural erasure, and assimilation. And now I've had to spend the last decade and a half of my adult life unlearning those awful American lessons. What I do know is that I'm a pretty unusual, I'm a tremendous anomaly, because in my own search for belonging and well-being in this country, as an immigrant, I was propelled into social and racial justice activism and education, and actually into the hallways of the institutions that work for systems change, so nonprofits, social sector organizations, philanthropy. In contrast, most young people today are not at all incentivized to invest their time and talent in social justice efforts, especially when it comes for the reformation or the transformation efforts for the systems that abandoned them in the first place. And this holds doubly true, right, if we're talking about opportunity youth who are broke, out of school, out of employment, with pretty insecure social supports. Young people in this country face years of systemic abandonment and neglect, and they face narrative and cultural harm because society tells us routinely that they are dispensable, disengaged, not powerful, not worthy, not valuable, and uneducated, drain on societal resources. This horrific list can go on, right? And because they are mostly young people of color, they don't have control over the platforms to tell their own stories on their own terms in ways that influence policy and systems change, which means really that they don't have their own narrative infrastructure. Narrative infrastructure is the ability of any community to own and control the means of production, distribution, and meaning-making for their own stories. Young people do not own or control the means of production or distribution for their own books, their TVs, their shows, their films, their podcasts, plays, or theater. Where are their journalistic outfits? Outside of social media, where are their stories moving the needles on systems change for policy and policy change? And where exactly are opportunity youth telling their stories on their own terms and in their own voices in order to cut through the dominant harmful narratives that invisibilize and disenfranchise them? Stories are the building blocks of narrative. They're the building blocks of narrative. And therefore, story-based strategy is essential to narrative strategy. To build power for young people, we need to intervene in the types of stories and narratives we tell about them, and we need accessible storytelling platforms that are curated, shaped, and owned, literally owned, by young people themselves. So I'm delighted actually today on the plenary we'll get to hear from a range of folks, including organizations that have been building real narrative infrastructure and power by investing in stories and voices of young people like Youth Speaks. I've been thinking a lot recently about what kinds of visionary and catalytic changes are possible when we trust youth-led movements to organize for change outside of the systems that fail them and in the absence of narrative infrastructure to resource them. So to think about all of this together, I'd actually like to invite you all to sink your teeth into two entwined provocations or questions, which I'll bring up the first one on the screen here. The first question I have for us is imaginative in a way. What becomes possible when young people of color exercise their tremendous self-determination and storytelling power outside of the institutions and systems that fail them in the public realm of narrative and culture? The second question is a little more tactical. How can you all, as the OYF network, activate to build narrative and cultural power for Opportunity Youth? So let's dig in, yeah? To help us answer these two fairly enormous questions, I'm going to actually share a few simple concepts about narrative and cultural strategies and a few comparative global and domestic examples. And I'll primarily be referencing tools that were co-developed in the Butterfly Lab for Immigrant Narrative Strategies, which was a 3-year capacity building narrative change program housed at Race Forward that built narrative power for migrants, immigrants, and refugees. And some of the tools and the frameworks I'm referencing are in the toolkit, which is open source and available online at any point in time. So the first thing to understand about narrative and cultural strategy is that narrative and culture operate at the level of worldview and meaning making. I like to say that narrative and culture are fundamentally epistemic, which means that they help us understand why we believe what we do, why we behave the way we do, and why and how we can change. A couple of years ago at the Collective Impact Forum convening, I shared this simple analogy, and it was originally offered up by my colleagues Jeff Chang, Liz Mann, and Erin Potts in a Medium article on cultural strategies. The analogy is that of the night sky, and it helps us tie together the 3 prongs of story-based strategy, narrative strategy, and cultural strategy, and it goes like this. A single story is like a star. It is bright, shiny, attractive. We look to it, it grabs our attention, and our brains are actually hardwired to think in stories, so we notice it and absorb it instantly. A narrative, in comparison, is like a constellation, which is an aggregate of stars that come together to form a meaning-making pattern. Narratives are comprised of many stories that fit together in a pattern that have been repeated over many, many years, sometimes decades. And like constellations, narratives are navigational, right? We actually look to them in the sky to locate ourselves, to find direction, to understand where we want to go. Narratives tell us what to feel, how to act, what to believe. And lastly, culture, in comparison, is like the galaxy. It's really massive, right? It's comprised of hundreds, if not thousands, of narratives that battle with each other in the culture. Our own home galaxy, for those of you space nerds like me, our Milky Way, has constellations and a million other components, planets, nebulas, black holes. In that way, culture includes narratives, but also many other elements. What's important to understand about this analogy is that to engage each level of strategy, we actually do have to work to change our stories, to change our narratives, and to fundamentally compost toxic culture and create new, liberatory, galactic cultural conditions. So we work at all 3 levels: stories, narratives, and culture change. Narrative and cultural strategies work with the raw material of meaning making, which includes things like our cultural norms, our values, our belief systems, ideas or mental models that influence daily what we imagine, perceive, and how we behave in regards to young people. They help millions of people make meaning differently and experience reality differently. Now, narrative and cultural strategies also do one other really important thing, which is they fundamentally shift the Overton window. You can see it up on the slide over here. The Overton window was originally proposed by policy analyst Joseph Overton, and it's also called the window of discourse or political viability. So you can see on this image that the boundaries of a policy window are usually boundaries that extend to ideas that are already popular, acceptable, or sensible in our culture. The work of narrative and culture change is to push out the boundaries of the Overton window so that ideas that are less dominant, less thinkable, can make their way into the mainstream and be seen as sensible and popular enough for us to craft policy platforms on. This is a foundational principle of narrative and cultural strategy, that to work for policy solutions in the long term, first and foremost, we have to radically imagine those possibilities, and then we actually have to transform the cultural conditions so that those policies can stick, right? I also like the Overton window because it shows us a fundamental point, which is that culture constrains politics. Politics is also where some of the people are some of the time, and culture is where most of the people are most of the time. So how exactly do we transform the Overton window with and for young people? And how do we do this when there is a massive dearth of storytelling and narrative platforms and infrastructure controlled by young people? So to grapple with this, I actually would just like us to zoom out briefly from the boundaries and constraints of our social sector and even some of our domestic context to look at some comparative examples. It's absolutely true that systems change requires us to transform systems from within. We know that, right? And it's also true that policy initiatives do produce appropriate pressure and incentives for systems change. But it's also true that widespread systems changes have been sparked and sustained by social movements that are mass mobilizations of people power that are rooted in changing narratives and culture. So you all remember back to 2021, sort of right in the middle of the pandemic, there was this thing called the Great Resignation that sparked off. You remember that? Everyone started quiet quitting, divesting their time and energy from exploitative and capitalist working conditions. Folks began sort of leaving the labor market and their jobs en masse. The form of cultural protest that is the Great Resignation, to note, has never been institutionally sanctioned or encouraged or resourced. Quite the opposite, actually. The Great Resignation at its core is a cultural movement, right? And it's in response to capitalist extraction and declining work conditions that affect the health and well-being of billions of young workers across the globe. Now, you all remember that quiet quitting in the US sparked off during the pandemic. At least that's when we started hearing about it a lot, right? But in China, a youth-led social protest movement has actually been fomenting ever since 2016. Young people, mostly under the age of 35, facing tremendous pressure to overwork while staring down an economically precarious future, band together to call the Tang Ping or lying flat movement. I don't know if you've all heard of it. I thought about pulling up some images to show you, but it's the lying flat movement. So most of the images were of people taking naps with their cats. And that's one of the sort of indicators of the movement, lying flat. In 2016, a 20-year-old Luo Huazhang in China, he quit his factory job. He announced that he would never be working again, and he posted a declaration online called "Lying Flat is Justice." And he coined this phrase, Tang Ping, lying flat, as a Chinese passive resistant protest against the 996 working hour system, which in China refers to the rat race, where Chinese workers work 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week at the enormous expense to their health and their well-being. Tang Ping in China, the Great Reshuffle in Australia, quiet quitting here in the US and the global phenomena. These are actually youth-led social movements that deliberately aimed to transform beliefs, behaviors, and systems that affect our work and our labor. Now, years later, from 2016 to now, there's incredible cultural and systems change impacts as a result. Here we're seeing workplaces unionizing themselves suddenly without the help of the formal labor movement. We're seeing worker co-ops emerge, shifts to improved working conditions in some sectors, attention to wage stagnation and unaffordable living costs. Right? And note the ironic dissonance and resistance in the relationship between cultural and narrative movements in the policy arena. In the US right now, multiple states like Iowa, Arkansas, I think New Jersey, New Hampshire, are actively weakening legal and policy restrictions on child labor specifically. In this particular case, narrative and cultural organizing efforts have produced real tangible improvements in workplaces, and that in itself is a powerful case-making strategy for reconnection pathways for employment for youth. Young people want good jobs, right? And they're not waiting around for policies to catch up to them. They're changing the narratives themselves. I shared this small example of Tang Ping and the Great Resignation to make the point that youth-led social movements are powerful engines for narrative and cultural change, and they can often move at the scale of millions, across borders, outside sectoral, systemic, political, and electoral constraints. And we've actually seen some powerful narrative and cultural responses change the Overton window in our own lifetimes. Movements like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Trust Black Women, Water is Life, the climate justice movement globally, these have all been engaging at the level of narrative fights to foster justice, whether it's in the workplace, in schools, or in right relationship to our planet. Youth movements across the globe are fighting rising authoritarianism and climate chaos with creativity and innovation and risking their lives to do so, right? In the US, the Sunrise Movement marries electoral strategies to facilitate climate resiliency and the Green New Deal. In India, my home country, I learned just a few months ago, 22-year-old Disha Ravi from the Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion social movement was arrested as a political prisoner on sedition charges because what she did is she went online, she posted a climate justice toolkit in support of Greta Thunberg's activism and in support of the farmer protests in India. In digital spaces, young fans use pop culture organizing strategies for political direct action. You remember when the global BTS army, who are the super fans of the K-pop band BTS, disrupted Trump rallies in 2020? They bought out all the arenas so that when he showed up to do the rallies to speak, the arenas were empty. Everywhere, young people who are experiencing systemic abuse, abandonment, and neglect are rejecting the false myths of progress that do not serve them. Right? We know that systems resist change, but we also know that they can change when the surrounding culture facilitates a just transition and creates an authorizing or permissive environment for systems change. What this means is that durable systems changes are not possible without narrative and cultural strategies for change. This also means that narrative and cultural strategies are actually not just nice to have strategies or nice to have additions to our work. They are often the reason we win or we lose, and they have the power to fundamentally change our society and our systems. So I began by asking this first provocation, right? What becomes possible when young people of color exercise their tremendous self-determination and storytelling power outside of the institutions and the systems that fail them in the public realm of narrative and culture? The answer is perhaps that the metamorphosis of our lives, our culture, and our material conditions is possible. Led by youth, grounded in communities in deep and beloved partnership with intergenerational and global social justice movements, this kind of cultural metamorphosis is on its way. It's already happening. All we have to do is stoke the fire, resource the young people, grow their narrative power and infrastructure, and connect our work to broader narrative and culture change movements. So let's pick up the second question, the much more tactical one that I proposed at the beginning. How can you, as the OYF network, activate to build narrative and cultural power for opportunity youth? There are two simple frameworks that might be supportive to integrate as you think about this question. And the first one is called a narrative system, also pulled from the Butterfly Labs toolkit. A narrative system is simply a set of deep narratives or values that together describe a worldview. deep narratives are values that together describe a worldview. The Butterfly Lab defined a narrative system as a set of aligned deep narratives that actually provide a destination for narrative work across a spectrum, whether that work extends to rapid response communications, to policy campaigns, to cultural strategies, to longer-term narrative work. Narrative systems set our values, help us find alignment and consensus across projects and timelines, which you can imagine is essential in a network. And it also allows us to connect our work to other social movements. So within a network like yours, a shared narrative system works like a narrative sky for you all to navigate towards. So here is an example, briefly, of a narrative system that you're probably really intimately familiar with, because it's the narrative system of the status quo. You're living in it every day, right? So hopefully this looks familiar. You know we already live in a world where we experience narratives around scarcity, around white supremacy, around equating human value with economic value. This looks familiar, right? I see some of you nodding and also looking horrified, which is the right response. So in contrast, the Butterfly Lab immigrant narrative system, we co-created this with organizers, policymakers, artists, and cultural workers across the immigrant rights movement. And you can see here that our narrative system for the future has 6 interlocking deep narratives, including interdependence, safety, dignity, the freedom to thrive, belonging, and abundance. Across the network, you can catalyze, organize, and align your narrative work by identifying the deep narratives that are essential to the world that you would want to create for young people. And as you build the OYF narrative system, you must ceaselessly practice deep listening and participatory narrative development processes so that you are guided fundamentally by the stories, visions, and goals of young people themselves. This is extremely important because all humans reject a story of the future in which they cannot see themselves, right? So for reconnection pathways to be truly viable for young people of color, the story of that reconnected and engaged future, the story of the trusted institutions that serve them, that has to be a story that fits young people, that inspires them, and one in which they can see their vibrant and purposeful future. Now lastly, activating a narrative system through a network, you actually can't do it alone. You need to do it with the work and support of many, many cross-sector collaborators and partners, all of whom would be moving with shared collective impact goals and a common set of narrative and cultural goals. So narrative systems work best when activated through a cross-sector narrative ecosystem, which is similar to what you're seeing on the image here, essentially a broad coalition of many types of change makers and meaning makers, from journalists to researchers to artists to poets to policymakers and more. As my time is approaching, I just want to end here with a closing thought for you all, something I've been thinking about a lot. As adults, we have had many of our gifts and capacities beaten out of us by the systems that we engage in. Right? At school or at work. We're not regularly playing, we don't tell our stories, we don't dream and imagine or experiment. We contort ourselves into smaller or more diminished versions of ourselves, and as a result, we struggle in our efforts to create change. To responsibly change our culture, we need to stop imposing these same constraints and restrictions on young people, forcing them also to contort and conform and code switch and assimilate into systems that serve neither them nor us, right? We need to take up the charge of what narrative and culture change really means, which is reimagining the way that we make meaning, the ways in which we derive purpose and direction and foster well-being and belonging in our lives. So let's please keep following the vision and leadership of young people. Let's resource their stories and help them build narrative power at scale. I'm going to stop here so we can move into the plenary. Thank you all for the gift of your attention and time this morning. And please see me afterwards if you want to continue to talk or if you'd like access to any of the open source resources that I mentioned. Thank you so much.
That was very good. So I want to kick us off by what's sitting with me is how rich and substantive that was, how comprehensive that was, and as we think about like where and how to hang our learning hooks into the substance of what was just shared, I want to now transition us into this idea that the next part of this conversation is an opportunity to ground it in examples of what this work looks like in organizations, in communities, again, across a range of approaches. So that's really the next part of the conversation we're going to have. But what I want you all to know is that we're going to have this conversation together, and we're going to have some fun together. I want to quote Geneva because we're going to do something really beautiful together. We are going to have an opportunity with you all to begin to identify new narratives. As we are thinking about that narrative sky that Nayantara mentioned, I want to invite each of you to start thinking about, in the next 10 years, what are the narratives our country, our world, will now hold and center when we are talking about youth and young adults, especially youth and young adults of color. We're going to come to you with that question, and so I want to invite you to just hold that question in your heart as we begin, as this dialogue with the panelists unfolds, because we're going to have some time to hear from you all and together begin to identify those narratives that's going to help us collectively shape our work over the next 10 years. So thank you for holding that question in your heart, and let me do this quick introduction of our esteemed panelists. So all the way here on my left, I want to introduce Holly Cook Macarro, principal of The Angle. Thank you for being here with us. Next to Holly is Zouhair Mussa, young adult leader from Youth Speaks. Zou, thank you for being here with us. Next to Zou is Michelle Mushli, executive director of Youth Speaks. Michelle, you already know. Thank you for being here with us. And then last but not least is Nat Kendall Taylor, CEO of Frameworks. Nat, thank you for being here with us. Where I want to start this conversation is, again, thinking about all that Nayantara just shared with us. Whoever wants to get us started, I'm just really curious to hear what's sitting with you. How did that resonate? What kind of meaning did you make of what Nayantara just shared?
Y'all can hear me? Kind of. All right. Me, shit, I don't believe in, like, so you could do it in many ways, right? You could go work within the system and like try to change something, but I don't believe that the system is gonna change, and like that's just what it is. It was built like that, you feel me? It's gonna stay like that. They in the power, you know what I'm saying? It needs to be a power shift, right? So and then you gotta be ready for war, bro, because you go create something for yourself, you go do something for yourself, for your community, they gonna tear you down. It's facts. It's happened before, it's gonna happen again, you know what I'm saying? So you just gotta be ready for that. But yeah, you gotta build something outside of the system. You know what I'm saying? Something to combat the system. You feel me?
We do. We do feel you, Zou. Thank you. That's a good point.
I'll say something as someone who kind of thinks about narrative and culture quite a bit. I just really appreciated the kind of elegance at which Nayantara talked about the relationship of stories and narrative and culture and the connections between them. I don't think I've ever heard it quite kind of spelled out in that kind of leveled or stepped up way. And I just personally thought that was really helpful in terms of my thinking. I think it's really a kind of pragmatic and actionable way of thinking about how you get to something that always feels so overwhelming and almost impossible as changing culture. I mean, that seems like, when I hear people talking about changing culture, it just, as an anthropologist who studies culture and has studied American culture on social issues for 20 years, it just feels so utterly overwhelming and impossible. And I did not feel any of those things when you were talking. And I think it was because of kind of the way that you related those three concepts. I found that really helpful. And that's sticking with me.
Thank you. And to connect that back to Zou, I think that's also why this idea of like where we start and what we build in terms of infrastructure. So your point of not even going into the system and creating our own structure, our own organizations for how to do this work. Yes, that's right, because it can feel so overwhelming, and where we start, it matters. Mush, Holly, anything you want to add?
I was looking at the Overton window. I was really kind of fascinated by that. And what did you, so the Overton window is what is considered, what was the word you used, like acceptable? Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
And then just outside of that was I took a picture, radical and unthinkable. And that the point you talked about pushing that window. And I work with, I'm the chair of the board for Illuminative, which I think many of you are familiar with, and I also work with Indian Collective. And part of what Indian Collective does is really I think, pushing that window, that making what feels like is radical and unthinkable really, the norm, or something that we should be doing in some instances. Sorry, I'm trying. So.
Yeah, making the impossible possible. That's
Yeah.
right. Mush, anything from you before we move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I want to recognize both the content, but also the messenger. It's incredibly refreshing to have someone like Nayantara, first generation undocumented woman of color, multilingual, that is in an institution like the one we're in today, delivering the call that culture actually shapes policy, which can be a very, not everyone believes that yet.
Yeah.
And I also want to recognize every artist in the room. I don't know who here is like, I'm a secret poet. And I can't because this is a policy conversation. I just want to recognize and thank Nayantara and those in the field of narrative and culture work who are recognizing the work of culture bearers.
Yes.
Who are really the clarion call for the shift that's needed. And then policy moves accordingly. So I just want to recognize that.
I love that. I want to lift that up, the culture bearers, right? They are the ones who help us really productively move this work forward. All right, so thank y'all. I want to now come to you, Nat, because as we think about this really big concept of narrative change, cultural strategy, building narrative infrastructure and power so that we can make the impossible possible, I want to come to the work of Frameworks Institute, because what you all have been doing is this narrative change work, but you also have been doing this work with a specific focus and emphasis on opportunity youth. So I would love to invite your work into this room and help us to understand not just what you're doing, but what are you learning in your efforts to do narrative change, cultural strategy, and partnership on behalf of opportunity youth.
Great, thank you. It's a good question. I feel like everything that I was going to say, Nayantara just said, but better than I can say it. So I'm like trying to think about how I'm going to use my 3 minutes here. I guess Frameworks and me in particular as an anthropologist are I'm all about culture and changing it for the reasons that Nayantara said. Kind of because culture really informs what we expect, what we demand, kind of what we see as common sense and what we see as nonsense. And so culture is really the ground, as Mush just said, is really the ground on which we make decisions, on which we set priorities. And I'm interested in narrative, not for narrative's sake, but for the ability of narrative to move and change culture. So it's important to say that. And I think that narrative is one of the most, it's not the only, but one of the most powerful tools that we have to change culture. And when I say culture, it's important, like if you ask an anthropologist to define culture, you get as many answers as you ask anthropologists. So like when I say, that was a joke, nobody laughed at that. When I say culture, I'm really interested in another word that Nayantara used, which is cultural mindsets, right? Cultural mindsets are these implicit patterns of reasoning or assumptions that we have that shape how we see the world. There are these powerful lenses that make it such that in this country, it's common sense that all of our social safety net policies have work requirements. Like, why is that? That's culture. That's common sense, and not having them is nonsense, right? They are multiple. We have multiple kind of cultural mindsets that can shape how we think. And they're shiftable, right? They respond to the ways that we position messages, the stories we tell, the narratives that those stories kind of clump together. In our work on Opportunity Youth, we've found kind of 3 mindsets in particular as being powerful blockers and impeders of progress. So one, which Nayantara also had on her slide, is individualism, the sense that the world is the way that it is, that outcomes are the way that they are, as an exclusive result of how hard we try, right? Grit, gumption, drive, however you want to call it, which turns out isn't untrue, but if that's how we see and think about the world, there's a whole bunch of things that surround us and shape our well-being that drop out of view. Power, systems, institutions, relationships, communities, resources, all those things cease to matter when compared to the almighty power of those bootstraps, right? The second is fatalism, the sense that the world is too far gone, that issues are too dire and numerous and on fire for us to do anything about, and therefore when presented with yet another one of them, do we lean in and engage? Absolutely not. We tune out, we turn off, and we're on to the next issue. And then most kind of toxic and pernicious of all is otherism, right? The kind of double whammy for young people of color in particular. There's 2 types of otherism, young people, and then the way that we otherize young people and the way that we otherize communities of color. The way that we have an immediate sense of making issues us and them issues, of taking the world and putting on a lens in which we see issues from a zero-sum perspective. So I'm really interested in how we can create narratives that shift those mindsets in directions that are more conducive to the kind of change that we want to see. I'm interested in what those narratives are, but I'm also really interested in how we share them while telling our own stories, right? That's a really interesting balance in this concept of narrative and stories. And then I'm most interested in the strategies that we can use to kind of create extended surround sound. So how do you get those new narratives out at a dose, at a scale, with a persistence over time that you can expect that Overton window not just to shift and snap back, but to send it clear forever in the direction that we want it to go.
Thank you for that, Nat. So I want to bring that back to this idea of, like, you know, when Nat talks about the individualism, the fatalism, the otherism, I want to come back to the framework that you all put together, which is exactly the opposite of that. Can you just connect some dots there so that as our network is thinking about how we counter the types of narratives he's talking about, on the other side of that continuum, as we're dreaming the impossible possible, what's the opposite of that, Nayantara?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that, and I know other folks will have thoughts as well. So those 3 narratives and mindsets, actually, the narratives that perpetuate those mindsets that Nat just mentioned, they actually lock together. I mean, folks are not walking around in the world experiencing only individualism or only otherism. They're experiencing a set of systems and behaviors and relationships that influence all 3 and actually operationalize all 3 of those problematic cultural mindsets together, right? So young people are walking around feeling othered, feeling endangered, probably, feeling fatalistic and hopeless and cynical, and then also feeling deeply, individualistic, right? Like that they actually have to solve their problems by themselves. So one way to actually think about narrative system design and development in a network like yours is identifying the narratives that lock together, the deep narratives that lock together in a worldview that actually counters the aggregate worldview that Nat was talking about as well, right? Because you don't just fight individualism with collectivity, for example. You have to have a surround sound system of all these mindsets reinforcing each other so that the entire worldview is disrupted. And so that's a distinction I want to make, is when narratives do battle with each other in the culture, which they do, you're not fighting one narrative against one narrative. That is actually an assumption that we have in communication strategy about how messaging works, that if you just keep hitting one message against another message, that you eventually displace the problematic message. And it does work in some specific cases, but that's not how narratives and worldviews work. You actually have to supplant a worldview that is toxic and harmful with a whole nother set of belief systems that form an aggregate worldview together.
And that is a perfect segue to Holly. I'm coming to you next. This idea that we can design and work toward a collective worldview that holds this vision of us working to make the impossible possible. So Holly, you are a correspondent for Indian Country Today, a national Native news outlet, and you are the board chair of Illuminative, an unapologetically ambitious and innovative Native women-led organization grounded in core Native values and community and guided by research, with the mission to build power for Native peoples by amplifying contemporary Native voices, stories, and issues to advance justice, equity, and self-determination. I want y'all to understand, this is why I'm taking my time to walk through this, how powerful this is. You utilize research, narrative, and culture change strategies, movement building, and organizing to disrupt the invisibility of Native peoples, to re-educate Americans, and to mobilize public support for key Native issues. So yesterday we had Professor Amanda Tashini with us, and she talked specifically about Native erasure and invisibility and how that harms Native youth. Specifically, the narratives around that and how those narratives really essentially function as monsters in our education systems. That was her framing. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us, Holly, not just share your work with us, but in sharing your work with us, can you talk about what is unique around building narrative power and cultural change strategies within Native communities? And as we think about our network, and how all of us are really working to make the impossible possible. Part of what I'm hoping that you might speak to is, especially for our Native and Indigenous partners, how do we continue to do this work in ways that really reflect this shared vision that we have for supporting our Native youth, and for our young adult partners? How do we support them to do exactly what Nayantara was speaking to around that infrastructure, that platform for young people?
Okay, I only have 3 minutes, right?
Yeah.
And we were laughing when we were preparing for this, and that we didn't want anyone to go off on a long speech. And I said, in Indian country, we call that a buffalo speech. There's always some tribal leader who goes on and on and on. And but I love the question. At Illuminative, we have just had our 5-year anniversary. And the visionary person at Illuminative is our executive director and founder, Crystal Echohawk, who has been a leading voice and just a force with what I call her superpowers in really affecting narrative change. I think she was probably most high profile in changing the name of the Washington professional football team. There were so many people who had done that work before, but getting it across the finish line took, I think, this sort of vision that amplified and utilized our youth via social media, right? Putting out content that could be easily shared and educating through social media in those snippets and about why it's harmful, why it harms our youth, why that narrative is not honoring Native Americans, right? It was so persistent, and it was so troubling too, because it would be all of Indian country, right? There would be tribal leaders, the National Congress, every organization, and then they would find one Indian who supported it, and that would be on the front page of the Washington Post. So, and that's, I think, part of like the systems you were talking about. We have to change the systems, and that's part of the work that I do at Indian Collective. And I think part of what I think is unique about organizing and trying to make these changes in Indian country is, one, we have so many opportunities. We're either invisible, or our culture is being appropriated, or we are being directly attacked. We recently at Indian Collective, and a lot of this action and response at Indian Collective is really youth-driven. But the Grand Gateway Hotel in Rapid City put up a sign that said, "No Native Americans," just plain as day, front door, and usually when this happens, there's a bit of an outcry, gets some attention for about a week, and then it's not on the reservation, so a tribal government doesn't really take it on, right? Because they've got responsibilities on the res. And so, but Indian Collective, and really led by our action team and a woman named Sunny Redbear, they stood outside of Grand Gateway for months, every single day. And we really pushed on the policy side to get the attention of the Department of Justice. And in December of last year, the Department of Justice announced they were filing federal charges. And it was an extraordinary, I think, effort, one led by the youth, but also by the vision of Nick Tilson at Indian Collective, that there's these spaces to fill. And so coming at it, when I say we have these opportunities both from the illuminative perspective, right? Yeah. Driving that conversation about with education, and then with Indian Collective where we do direct action. We saw it with Mount Rushmore when President Trump visited. We had a direct action for Leonard Peltier from the White House last month, and that is really, that's actually a huge narrative change where the FBI has fed a narrative to the United States for a long time, but every level of the prosecution has stepped forward. So the narrative that we're changing is not, free letter, it's about justice and a symbol of justice for our community. And we have to do that not just with America, but with the president and our elected leadership and the Bureau of Prisons, right? So narrative change there about justice and what that means in Indian country involves direct action, involves all of that. And I guess when I was thinking about all of those things that you were talking about and looking at the systems, all of those, all of that has worked against Indian country for so long. And that's what I think, gosh, we have so many opportunities. We could take them on from each of these different pillars. We're trying, but it's a handful.
Yeah. And it's such an important part of how we all collectively get there, right? Yeah. Making the space. I really appreciate you specifically speaking to the work on the ground, like this idea of young people organizing, standing outside of the store for months, but then at the same time doing advocacy work with the justice system to also get the laws changed. And it makes me think about your connection to, it's not just a narrative, but it's the cultural strategy. But then, Holly, you are able to bring in the real work on the ground, like what young people are doing, young people out in community, young people not just being visible, but being visible in a way that helps us move to the type of the policy wins, but also Nat's point, keeping that Overton window open so that we can get the policy changes that are necessary. And your story of what young people have done is actually the perfect segue now to Youth Speaks. So Zoo and Mush, I'm so excited to come to you because Nayantara made this very important call to our narrative change work being fundamentally about creating platforms for our young adult partners to be able to tell their own stories. That the narrative infrastructure we must all design together is about young people owning their stories, how their stories become part of a broader narrative, and how that narrative drives cultural strategy. And what I love is that Youth Speaks is one of the foremost organizations that is young people doing that, harnessing narrative power to drive and change narratives. So I want to come to both of you and not just bring your voice and your work into this conversation, but help us understand, ground us in, what does it look like to do this work? As a young adult leader, what are you doing? How are you tapping into your narrative power and doing your narrative change work? And how can our partners around the room learn from your work?
Shit, you want to, excuse me, but look, you want to change the narrative, you got to change who in the room. Like, you want to change these conversations, you need to change who in the room. Man, the corporations run the show, bro, they got all this money, right? We want to talk about tax write-offs. You want to go do a tax write-off. McClymonds High School in West Oakland still got lead in their water, bro. Like, actually act like you care, about the community, you know what I'm saying? I'm a part of, like, a couple, I find myself in, like, participatory research rooms, you know what I'm saying? I feel like we should do a lot more of that. But don't have Walmart go, all right, go tap on a community leader, go fund it, no strings attached, know who you talking to, you know what I'm saying? Actually have the people do it for the people, and then we can start there. Start by, all right, let's go pay the people, see what the people need, you know what I'm saying? Pay them for their time, pay them, see what they need, and then, all right, let's start from there. Let's create an action plan. Let's actually do it, you know what I'm saying? You gotta change who in the room, you feel me?
Change who's in the room.
Okay, we got some town folks here. Thanks. May I add to that? May I ask everybody if anybody in the room has ever engaged or heard about the term narrative or cultural strategy? Please please raise your hand if you have heard the term, if you have engaged in the term. Okay. Has anybody ever engaged in narrative campaigns? Like you've done? Okay. So like 8 of us. Great. Wonderful. That's a joke. There was like at least 30 of us. So we have 3 minutes, and I'm a poet. Yes, I'm an executive director, but I'm a poet, and I don't like to come scripted, but I have because we have 3 minutes. May I? Do it. YouSpeaks is headquartered in San Francisco, California. We've been around for 27 years. For the last 17 years, we have engaged in something called narrative strategy work. We've launched 8 regional, statewide, and national youth-led artist campaigns around issues that I won't get into. But for most folks who are introduced to the term narrative or cultural strategy, it's really intimidating. It's like, what is that? Do I have to be an artist? What is a strategist? So I want to share a story about our first campaign. We've done 8. One of our type 2 diabetes public health campaigns, which is really about reframing the public health conversation about who is susceptible to type 2 diabetes, which is often Black and brown poor communities in urban and rural areas, wasn't being talked about. This was a disease that didn't exist 100 years ago, and in California is now an epidemic. So that's a story that wasn't being talked about. I'm not going to talk about that, and that was recognized by the World Health Organization, and YouSpeaks was honored to lead that work. I'm going to talk about our first narrative change work that most people do not know about. It was in 2006. Does everybody remember in 2006 that big film that came out that was around global warming? So just to set some context, in 2006, YouSpeaks launched our pilot, what we called our first narrative change campaign. We called it Speak Green. So just to set some context, in that time, take yourself back to 2006, wherever you were professionally, you know, whoever you were dating at the time or wanted to date but weren't dating at the time. So a little bit of kind of cultural context. In 2000, in the mid to early 2000s, Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth had come out. It was making like $50 billion at the box office. Youth poets and hip-hop culture in particular was being catapulted to the mainstream in the ways of HBO Def Poetry Jam. It had seen its 6th season. It had been picked up on Broadway. Russell Simmons and Stan Lathan were kind of really catalyzing this kind of new urban aesthetic, okay? Hip-hop theater was something that funders across the country were really starting to look deeply in as this is a new mode of art and theater. This is amazing. Let's fund this. We were also in the middle, smack in the middle of the Iraq War under the Bush regime. As well, in our home city of San Francisco, California, the organic waste collection started to offer curbside service in the West Coast, meaning we will come to you to pick up your recycling material. Okay, awesome, Mush. What the heck was that about? So this is in the mid-2000s. We launched a campaign called Speak Green because the story or the narrative that wasn't being told was this. These were the facts. 100 companies were making up 70% of global greenhouse emissions. 40% of America's Black populations were more likely to live in areas where the highest projected increases of extreme temperature-related deaths were going to happen. 43% of Latinx populations are most likely to live in areas with the highest projected reduction in labor hours due to extreme temperature. And finally, the changes to the coastal and river conditions for Alaska Native communities was impacting our livelihood, mental health, all of those things. Okay. So the story then that we knew that needed to be told that wasn't was the story around individualism. We are going to save the planet. Y'all remember the Save the Planet campaigns? And so much of it was about individual behavior versus structural shifts and accountability. So much of the environmental justice movement, y'all remember we were talking about it and calling it global warming in 2006? Today, that is almost obsolete. We're now calling it climate justice. And I will say that Youth Speaks is one of many organizations around the country during that time, including media agencies, including movement-based organizations and policy advocates, that were saying, what does it mean when we're not talking about the poorest communities in our country, that are often Black and brown communities, who are by default already engaging in conservation practices? Why weren't we getting the resources to lead that movement? One of the examples, and I'll pass this
Take
on,
your time,
is that it's always a simple story, which is one of our old students, Melanie Clay, West Oakland born and raised. We brought this issue about global warming and climate change, and recycling. It was all about, you should recycle, individual people. No, we don't need to recycle. We have oil refineries 5 blocks away from us. What are you talking about, recycling? She said, well, I want to engage in the global warming conversation with you all, but can you help me understand if what my family is doing is conservation? I have 3 siblings. When we take a bath, we often save the bath water to recycle it. The next sibling uses that water. We then use that, repurpose that final water again in our yard or in our home. Is that conservation? And that, to us, changed the entire story. From there, 150 young artists, BIPOC artists, presented to 72 mayors across the country to say, why aren't young people of color who are already engaged, again, by default in conservation practices, not at the forefront of these movements? And why are we not resourcing Black and brown youth who are naming these kind of gaps in knowledge as strategies to create policy? Otherwise, the policy that gets created is not actually a policy of the people.
Come on, give it up. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
So to connect what you just shared, making it illustrating what that looks like, Zoo talked about changing who's in the room. He talked about having young adults. Part of the participatory research, because this work goes to community and this work lives in community. So I just want to thank you for giving us a story that not just connects to what Zoo shared around how we should be thinking about and approaching this work, but grounding it in this really practical example. Thank you.
Monique, is it possible to share one more
You
sentiment?
should share, absolutely, yes.
All right, man, I just wanted to say, I don't, like, y'all probably heard the term socioeconomically deprived community, right? So I just want to say, if socioeconomically deprived communities still exist, it's obviously a problem with the government. You know what I'm saying? Yes. Obviously. Like, man, I don't know what it is. It was one of them factories. It just broke down in the West, similar. Bruh, yeah. So we got wildfires in California, and so when the wildfires come, the air quality is highly unhealthy. So when that factory broke down, it was the same thing. Like, the air quality was highly unhealthy, just as someone just went and burnt down the whole forest. So it's a problem with the government. You know what I'm saying? Let's not shy away from that. You know what I'm saying? It's a problem with corporations hoarding all this money. Let's not shy away from that. You know what I'm saying?
I think you have the right people in the room for that message, because our conversation today and the work collectively we are doing is about how we change the policies and systems in ways that hold our government accountable while continuing to put at the center our young adult partners, our Black and brown communities. Now, I want to turn to the audience, because I mentioned earlier that part of what we want to do here is we want to invite you all into this dialogue, and we want to together begin to identify some narratives that we can hold over the next 10 years of doing our narrative and cultural strategy, narrative change and cultural strategy work together. So in a moment, here's the question. I want to invite everybody in the audience to begin thinking about this question. And if you're able to go to slido.com or just pull this up on your phone. Please begin to just populate whatever's top of heart and top of mind to you as you think through what new values and narratives should we identify and center in our efforts to tell new stories about the power, vision, and impact of our young adult partners. So that's a big, meaty question, and the answer to that we get to collectively shape together today. And as your answers start to populate, part of what I want to do, and I want to give Nat credit for this, is in designing our time together today, we wondered, should we take some time to identify the current narratives that are so harmful, that are so pervasive as we continue to support young adult partners? And there was a sentiment of, why even do that? Why even revisit? We all know these narratives. We know how harmful they are. Why even take time? Let's just start dreaming new narratives together. Let's start identifying new narratives together. And then Nat reminded us that the real power in designing new narratives is understanding exactly how they begin to counter what already exists. And our efforts to make the impossible possible, we have to start and ground ourselves with where we are, so that as we are shaping the path forward, we begin to get really, really clear on how we get there together. So know this, I'm turning to the panelists now, and I want to ask you to just name, like as you think about your work, as you think about your partnerships with young adults, the power of youth speaks. I want to go through each panelist and ask you to name, top of mind and top of heart, what are those current negative narratives that exist? And then as the narratives come up on the screen, I want to bring you all into this conversation. So we have some mic runners, and I'm going to ask you to just raise your hand, and I'm going to invite you to give to give voice to what you have placed here, bring it into the room, and tell us why you chose this new narrative and why it's important to you. So thank you for populating it. In a second, I'm going to come to the audience. Holly, I'm going to start with you. Share with us current narratives harmful for young people that we know are destructive.
That Native Americans are invisible or don't exist and don't recognize that that there's contemporary Native Americans with thriving communities.
Thank you. Zoo?
Man, they be thinking little kids where I'm from don't care about their life, right? Like, it's your life, go do what you want to do with it, but it's real stuff out here. It's like real problems, real issues.
Thank you, Zoo.
6 words, culture is soft and policy is hard.
Thank you.
I'll say too, they're both really short. This narrative around, and I'm going to do this in quotes just to clearly signify this is not something I agree with, but urban poverty and all the ways that activates, as Nayantara said, all 3 of those mindsets that I talked about. And then the youth mental health crisis.
I'll add one that has been simmering in the conversation, which is that young people are too idealistic and unrealistic, and because they aren't in systems with power, they don't actually know how to change systems or institutions. But what's remarkable is almost all the stories we've heard have been stories of pretty significant culture change work that originated outside of systems through direct political action led by young people. So I'll just kind of pull apart that paradox right there. Young people don't know how to change systems, except they do all the time.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you. So we have our mic runners around. By a show of hands, please. Thank you. Thank you.
Like putting them in on there. Are these all the comments?
And as a friendly reminder, here's what we heard. Our Native young adults are invisible. We heard that young people do not care about their lives. We heard that our culture is soft and our policy is hard. We heard urban poverty and youth mental health. We heard that young people do not know how to change their lives. Yes,
Hello, everybody. My name is Jocelyn. I'm from Oakland, California. And I think that the new word or just value or narrative that we should focus on is substance use disorder. That can mean like the opioid epidemic, let alone what marijuana has done also to our communities. Because there's like a lot of narratives, but it has definitely, and it's impacting the young community.
Jocelyn, I just want to make sure that we heard what is the narrative that you want us to make sure we are holding and are changing new narratives about our young adult partners?
You're saying what is the narrative that we should uphold?
Yeah, as we think about our work to change narratives for young people, what's the new narrative you're suggesting that we center in our narrative change work for young people?
That young people are working tirelessly every night. We're not just working physically, we're also working mentally, spiritually, emotionally, to really get ourselves out of the economic poverty and societal narratives that are out there, and we always choose to identify and be authentic in our own storytelling. And we're fighting every day to really tell our stories the way that we are living them and the way that we're also every day acting with acts of resistance. And that means through poetry, through music, through art, through so many forms of multidisciplinary arts in which we all can definitely relate to. So I think that was probably a long one, but we're doing what we got to do.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Kamel Yard. I'm from New York. But I think one thing we have to think about with young people and in general with the work we do, I'm going to start by saying, like an analogy, you see a lot of young people go, I'm sick of seeing slave movies, right? But what we end up doing is teaching our young people that telling the truth about their experiences and their histories is a negative. And it's really not. It's a positive, because they have to know what came before them, so then they don't have to repeat the same mistakes again, right? That's why there's a lot of young people who don't see the value in direct action or even in voting, because they don't know the histories of what it means to effectively be civically engaged. So I think one of the things we have to hold is that bringing up your issues with any ism is not divisive or makes you negative or that you're trying to tear down the room. No, it has to be known, because if we're not all working from that same context of knowledge, we're not going to achieve anything.
Thank you. Thank you. So teaching young people the truth about their history to help to prepare them for the future.
Hi, everyone. DeLuke Smith, the Lewis Prize for Music. It has not been stated, so I want to state, there is an immense amount of youth narrative infrastructure in this country right now. The problem is it's abundantly existing and detrimentally under-resourced. And Youth Speaks is an example of what can mature. This is almost a 30-year-old organization. We have people in every one of the communities that you're in starting work like Youth Speaks in music, in dance, in theater, in media arts. That infrastructure is already in your community. You just need to find it and help it blossom. And I know from talking to the young people here, they're tapped into it. I had a young man come up to me last night and say, I've started a youth movement work in my community, but music saved my life. So that's an essential lesson for us all to remember, is this work is happening between adults and young people. It's just not getting seen and it's not getting resourced.
And thank you for that. Nayantara did actually. This is a big, big part of the call to action today, is the resourcing for it. Thank you for that.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Midnight Lujan. I'm indigenous to Taos Pueblo. Sorry, a little green on the mic here, but I have a question for Indian Collective. I think that the reality of invisibility as an indigenous person is linked to our sense of erasure in the literary world, in the media world. I mean, it's everywhere. We are often perceived, I think, in creative spaces as the ghosts that haunt the settler colonial state.
Stoic ghosts.
Yes, ma'am.
Never smiling.
Absolutely. You get it. You understand. So I'm curious to hear from you specifically how Indian Collective and maybe other Indigenous organizations are bridging the gap of informing non-Indigenous populations of our histories and our stories. So yeah.
I think we're using social media, right? And because it has been so effective in these snippets about Native Americans, it really has been very effective, very powerful. I think partly, from Illuminative side. But I think what Indian Collective does, and another 5-year-old organization, but I can't imagine Indian country now without the work that Illuminative does and without the work that Indian Collective does. Because we'd been so limited before by our elected tribal leadership, but with no real recognition that they're constrained by at-home electoral politics or their own, the priorities and politics of their own communities, right? That's what they're elected to do. But there's also this big space out there in responding to, No Dapple, to the Grand Gateway Hotel, because in the Grand Gateway Hotel, and I use that example because in every urban Indian community, in Seattle, in Minneapolis, in Denver, in Albuquerque, there's hotels that do the same thing. No natives, whether they put a sign on the front door or not. But now they know, right? There will be federal charges pressed. So that noise and that education is partly through direct action, partly through advocacy on the federal level. Like right now, we're trying to make sure, the Navajo allottees around Chaco Canyon, when the Navajo Nation government is against the withdrawal of the lands around Chaco from further mineral leasing, but the Navajo Nation is opposed to that withdrawal. But there are also individual Navajo allottees who are supportive of it, whose voice would be unheard. So there's that, and we have to educate the non-Indian community that our voices are diverse, and we do it by issue. We do it when it's universal on things like mascots. So it is through direct action, advocacy, and using things like social media. I'm not quite sure if that answers your question, but.
Absolutely. Oh, sorry. Yes, it does. Absolutely. I guess I just have a quick question for the audience, if that's okay. How many of you are familiar with anything that she had mentioned in regards to Indian country and what we're facing? Awesome. I'm with the right people. Thank you.
Awesome.
I feel safe.
Yes.
That surprised me.
Yes.
Thanks for asking that.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm going to take a guess here and probably surmise that I'm the oldest person in the room. I'm interested in this narrative issue because at the age of 15, I was arrested for the first time as an activist. I was a conscientious objector, participated in demonstrations and protests, and have continued that kind of activism. And with the youth that I work with now, my name is Jim Koppel, by the way, I'm with ACT Now. I'm interested in how the narrative gets sustained. What you learn as young people today in this activism, how you're doing it when you're 30, how you're doing it when you're 40, how you're doing it when you're 50. Does the narrative embrace that cross-generational or sustainable language that you keep it up, you don't quit? Because my mentors taught me never to quit. And I'm 74 years old, and I'm still raising hell. And I just want to know if that's part of the narrative.
It's hard work.
Yeah, please dive in.
You go, I already went. I'll just say that it's hard work, and most people burn out. Doing things like always responding, right? Direct action, and finding a narrative that you push, you educate. It's hard work, and I think about what the American Indian movement did in the 1970s for Indian country, and what their activism did, but they became the targets of the federal government as someone that was dangerous, that it wasn't just a civil rights movement. So they all, every single person in the leadership of the American Indian movement at one point was under investigation or had been arrested. And so, but keeping that, I always think they brought us to the table. They could never make the change from action and protests to impact on policy and legislation. And that was tiring for them. And I think it's something that we at Indian Collective really try to do and resource those who are in line with us. So thank you.
Shit, you can't stop. Like, the fight is against, all right, so look, this one, all of us, right, with the exception of Walmart and all them other corporations in this room, are give or take enemies of the federal government, right? Because for someone to lose, I mean, for them to win, we gotta lose. The people at the bottom gotta lose. So it's not no giving up. You can't stop fighting today if it's gonna be a fight with my grandkids. You feel me? There is no stopping the fight because you have to change the power. You know what I'm saying? You can't stop. Like, if it's an issue, like, if you don't feel these issues on the day-to-day, and, like, when you, like, 70 and you could just relax and it's cool, none of that bother you, then that's, you know what I'm saying, that's you. I guess these issues don't really apply to you, you know? But, yeah, bro.
I'd like to add, you know, we are now 27 years old, and technically a generation is 25 years. We are at the point now, you know, the common misnarrative about organizations like Youth Speaks is that we exist and we thrive primarily in the theatrical space or in the artistic space. 90% of our alumni do not pursue careers in arts and culture. However, once you learn a skill that allows you to see the world in a new way, you'll never not unlearn that skill. So we have alumni who are now first-time queer Black youngest city council people in Berkeley, California. We have alumni who are leading writers' rooms, Black femmes, in Hollywood, in Marvel. We have, lots of examples. We have business leaders in tech leading Blavity, which is one of the largest media companies in the world that serves the Black audience. And these are all Youth Speaks Brave New Voices alumni. So it's incredibly interesting for us as we sit back and watch how are young people who were originally poets and artists now impacting through their understanding of narrative and culture their own sectors. That's a whole other story. So if anybody's interested in funding an impact report, please come talk. I'm just kidding, but I'm not kidding.
Yeah. That's all right. That's all right. So Nat, we'll come to you, and then Nayantara, we'll close with you.
What's the question?
The question is, how do we, across the decades, the years of our life,
the last
decades,
question. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's like if the goal is culture change, there's like a bad news and a good news scenario. The bad news is that culture is deep and is durable and it is long and it stretches, and the status quo is incredibly well funded. Like those 5 pillars that Nayantara showed on that slide, like that's what Walmart is doing. That's what all the corporations are doing. That is a very well resourced position, right? That's the bad news. The good news is that culture can and does change. Right? And it can and does change in response to the stories that we tell and the narratives that they carry. And to me, it's that second part that is the reason why, like, I have hope and I am an optimist and I don't get perpetually overwhelmed and think pessimistically. And I thought, Mush, you're kind of twisting of that question into the positive way that you can hear the cross-generational argument. Not like, do I need to keep doing this? But once you're in, you keep doing this. Is a really different way of thinking about that question, and I love the way that you did that. That was great.
Yeah, I think my response is related, Nat, to what you're saying, and I love the question, and I loved how you phrased it too. How do you keep that sustained? How do you take a narrative? If you went to an activism event or an action years, decades ago, and how do you sustain that? And I just want to say something about that
in narrative work, it's true that narratives feel overwhelming and culture feels overwhelming, and it feels like these ideas have been around for centuries, they're hard to change. But it's also true, to Nat's point, that not only does culture actually change, people individually do change. People change their ideas fundamentally. They go from, 180-degree transformation sometimes based on what's happening in their life, in their relationships, also through the actual artistic and cultural experiences that they engage in. Just to go back to what Mush was saying, like actually not making arts and culture an instrumental or utilitarian part of narrative change work, because you can't change culture without culture bearers and culture makers and artists. They're fundamental to how narratives and culture change. But part of what I want to just lift out in this question is that because people do change, reliably they change. I mean, you think about some folks in your life who you're like, I knew you 30 years ago and you're not that person. You literally don't believe and see the world in the same way that you saw 30 years ago. That gives us a lot of hope, because it also tells us that narrative strategies are fundamentally about building new social identities, which is another way of saying you can make new people believe and live in different kinds of ways and actually change who they fundamentally are. So this is not a static thing. You don't just introduce an idea in 1970 and then you live with it, You get to change, you get to choose. There's incredible power and self-determination in this work, and that brings me a lot of hope.
And that is actually a perfect way to end this conversation, because everything we do is deeply grounded in self-determination. Self-determination of young people, self-determination of our communities, self-determination of this network as we are dreaming about the future to make the impossible possible. And what I want to do actually is ground this in a real example, because we've been talking about what's possible, how we change. And I want to give a shout out to our key partner, Dr. Marvin Carr, who actually leads the Racial Equity and Justice Center within Walmart. So talking about working inside of this system to do in every day this work of making the impossible possible. So this idea of what Nayantara just said, that it's not static, even these narratives that feel like they can't change, we know that we have people inside systems working to change them, while we also have people on the ground in community doing this work, the culture bearers that drive cultural strategy for us. All of this together is part of our work. All of this together is how we get to making the impossible possible. And here's what I'll close with. We are so thankful that we had an opportunity to do some crowdsourcing here today, to have you all help us begin to identify new narratives, because as I noted at the top of this plenary, we are at the very beginning of a learning journey on narrative change and on cultural strategy. And how we achieve this work is going to be the collective visioning of all of us here together, determining this path. So our conversation today, and you all helping us begin to give language to new narratives, is the foundation of how we are going to build together in the future. So I want to thank you all for your participation. I want to thank you all for the work that you are already doing in partnership with young people, our culture bearers helping to change narratives. And I need to ask you to join me in thanking these panelists for illustrating what this looks like.